Perception is a powerful lens through which people interpret the world, but it is also deeply flawed. It can shape how we see others, how others see us, and even how we see ourselves, often without any conscious awareness. In situations where wealth, race, and social status intersect, perception can become an even more potent force, influencing decisions and interactions before facts ever have a chance to surface. In the story of the billionaire and the simple black woman on the yacht, the billionaire's perception shaped the entire encounter. He saw someone who, in his mind, did not fit into the environment he believed he controlled. His assumptions about her clothing, demeanor, and perhaps even the color of her skin triggered a mental shortcut that told him she didn't belong. Without asking questions or seeking context, he acted on that perception as if it were reality. This is a common human tendency. We often rely on our immediate impressions to navigate the world quickly. Psychologists call this thin slicing, making rapid judgments based on limited information. In some contexts, it can be useful, even necessary. But when these quick judgments are fueled by biases, stereotypes, or incomplete information, they lead to mistakes. The billionaire's thin-sliced judgment led him to believe he was in the position of ultimate authority on his yacht, with the power to dictate who could stay and who must leave. His wealth reinforced his confidence in that perception, creating a sense of certainty that was entirely misplaced. Perception doesn't just mislead those with power, it also shapes how those with less visible influence move through the world. The woman in this story knew her own position, yet she didn't need to flaunt it. She understood that perception could work both ways, that others might underestimate her based on superficial cues. People who are often misjudged become skilled at reading the perceptions of others. They learn when to correct them, when to challenge them, and when to let them unravel on their own. This ability can be a quiet form of power, one that doesn't announce itself until the right moment. When perception is based on appearances alone, it tends to oversimplify complex realities. For the billionaire, ownership was an easy concept. The person who paid for the yacht controlled it. His perception excluded the possibility that someone who did not fit his idea of wealth could share that control. This limited view is rooted in a cultural narrative that equates outward displays of luxury with actual power. If someone wears expensive clothes, they are assumed to have influence. If they dress plainly, they are assumed to lack it. This is not only inaccurate but dangerous, because it blinds us to the diverse ways that power can exist and be expressed. Perception also plays a role in reinforcing social hierarchies. The billionaire's reaction was not just about who was on the yacht, but about protecting the exclusivity of the space. Exclusive spaces often depend on gatekeeping, both literal and psychological. The unspoken rule is that only certain types of people belong there. The perception of belonging becomes self-fulfilling. If the majority of the people in the space look or behave a certain way, anyone who differs stands out and risks being labeled as an outsider. This is how perception can perpetuate inequality without a single explicit rule being stated. The interesting twist in this scenario is how fragile perception can be once it collides with fact. For the billionaire, the revelation that the woman was a co-owner shattered his certainty in an instant. The same eyes that had scanned her and dismissed her were suddenly forced to see her differently. This shift reveals something important about perception: it is not fixed. It can be disrupted when confronted with undeniable evidence. But the problem is that this shift often comes too late, after harm has already been done or offense has been caused. What makes perception so tricky is that it is often invisible to the person holding it. We rarely stop to question why we think what we think, or why we assume what we assume. The billionaire likely didn't believe he was being unfair. In his mind, he was simply enforcing the order of his space. This is the deceptive comfort of perception. It makes our actions feel justified, even when they are rooted in error. If perception shapes action, then reshaping perception should be the goal. That requires an openness to being wrong and a willingness to pause before acting on first impressions. In situations where power imbalances exist, those with more authority have an even greater responsibility to question their own perceptions. They must ask themselves whether their judgment is based on truth or on a convenient narrative that reinforces their position. First impressions are formed in seconds, often before a single word is spoken. They are built from visual cues, body language, tone of voice, and even context, and they have the power to shape the entire trajectory of an interaction. In the case of the billionaire and the simple black woman on the yacht, the first impression was not mutual, it was one-sided. The billionaire saw her and, in an instant, decided she did not belong in that environment. He processed her appearance, her choice of clothing, her demeanor, and perhaps unconsciously, her race, and assembled a narrative in his mind that placed her outside the circle of acceptance. This mental snapshot became the framework for his behavior toward her, guiding his words and actions without ever pausing to verify whether his assumptions were correct. The science behind first impressions reveals just how stubborn they can be. Once we form an initial judgment about someone, our brains tend to filter incoming information in a way that confirms that judgment. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret evidence in ways that support our existing beliefs. For the billionaire, every detail he noticed after that initial moment likely reinforced his assumption that she was an outsider. Perhaps she wasn't mingling with the crowd or wasn't dressed in the expected symbols of wealth. Each small observation was interpreted through the lens of that first impression, making it harder for him to consider any alternative explanations for her presence. First impressions are not inherently bad, they are part of how humans quickly process a complex world. But they are heavily influenced by personal experiences, cultural conditioning, and social narratives. In high-status spaces like a private yacht, those narratives often involve ideas about wealth, exclusivity, and who belongs. When someone enters that space who does not match the visual script, it can trigger a subtle, or sometimes overt, policing of boundaries. The billionaire's reaction was a classic example of this dynamic. His first impression was not simply about her as an individual, it was about protecting the symbolic order of the space he believed he controlled. The woman's experience in that moment was likely informed by her own understanding of first impressions. People who are regularly judged based on stereotypes often become adept at reading and anticipating those judgments. She may have noticed the way he looked at her, the slight pause, the calculation in his eyes. She may have even predicted the interaction before it happened. Yet, rather than rushing to assert her status or preempt the insult, she allowed his first impression to stand, at least temporarily. In doing so, she set the stage for a more impactful reversal later. The power of first impressions lies in their ability to influence behavior almost automatically. The billionaire didn't stop to consider whether there could be more to her story. His initial judgment dictated his approach, a condescending instruction to leave. This behavior was not just a reflection of his thoughts in that moment but a reinforcement of the assumptions he had made seconds earlier. It demonstrates how quickly first impressions can move from thought to action, bypassing deeper reflection. However, first impressions are not immune to change. When confronted with clear evidence that contradicts them, they can be overturned, sometimes abruptly, as in this case. The revelation that she was a co-owner of the yacht didn't just change the billionaire's impression of her, it shattered the foundation of his initial judgment. But the speed with which his perception shifted also exposes a flaw in how first impressions work. They are highly responsive to visible symbols of status and power, which means that the same biases that led him to underestimate her could just as easily lead him to overcompensate once her true position was revealed. This highlights the performative nature of many first impressions, particularly in environments driven by wealth and social hierarchy. A person's treatment can change drastically based on a single piece of information, regardless of whether their character or abilities have actually changed. The woman's value, in his eyes, was recalculated instantly, not because she had done anything different, but because he now saw her through a different lens. This shift is a reminder that first impressions are rarely neutral, they are intertwined with societal values, status markers, and ingrained prejudices. In everyday life, this dynamic plays out in subtle ways. A person might be judged by the car they drive, the brand of clothes they wear, or even their accent. In professional settings, first impressions can influence hiring decisions, promotions, and partnerships. In social settings, they can determine who is welcomed into a group and who is excluded. On that yacht, the billionaire's first impression had the potential to strip the woman of her dignity, had she not possessed the quiet assurance of her own place in that setting. When first impressions are left unchallenged, they can become self-fulfilling prophecies. If the billionaire had never discovered her true status, his treatment of her might have reinforced his belief that she didn't belong, and her silence might have been interpreted as compliance rather than strategic patience. This is the risk in allowing first impressions to dictate behavior. They can trap both parties in roles neither of them consciously chose. Ownership is often perceived as something visible, a title deed, a luxury possession, a recognizable display of wealth. Yet, in reality, ownership can be far more complex and less obvious. Influence and control are not always worn like a badge, and the people who hold them may not match the stereotypical image of power. In the case of the billionaire and the simple black woman on the yacht, the dynamic was rooted in an unspoken assumption about who could and could not be an owner. The billionaire saw the yacht as an extension of his own authority, a symbol of his personal success, and assumed that anyone present without his explicit invitation was a guest at best, an intruder at worst. His mind did not account for the possibility that ownership could be shared, let alone shared with someone who defied his expectations of wealth. Hidden ownership challenges the conventional idea that power must be displayed to be real. Many people who hold significant assets or influence prefer not to advertise it. They may choose to live and dress modestly, move quietly in social settings, and allow others to make assumptions. This discretion can be strategic, a way to avoid unnecessary attention, or simply a reflection of personal values. The woman in this story embodied that form of understated authority. She did not need to wear the outward symbols of wealth to validate her position. Her ownership existed whether it was recognized or not. The tension arises when visible power collides with invisible power. The billionaire's wealth and status were on open display. The yacht itself was a statement of it. He relied on this display to command respect and compliance. Invisible power, on the other hand, operates without such declarations. It does not demand recognition to exist, but when it is revealed, it can upend an entire social dynamic. The moment the billionaire learned that the woman was a co-owner, his perceived dominance over the situation collapsed. The realization forced him to acknowledge a truth that had been there all along, hidden only by his own limited perspective. This scenario also illustrates how ownership is tied to identity in ways that are influenced by race, gender, and class. In a world where media and culture often portray owners of luxury assets as white, male, and visibly affluent, anyone who does not fit that mold is more likely to have their legitimacy questioned. The billionaire's reaction was not just about the yacht, it was about the disruption of a narrative he had internalized. To him, ownership was something that looked a certain way, and when confronted with evidence to the contrary, his worldview had to adjust abruptly. Shared ownership adds yet another layer to the discussion. Co-ownership is built on agreements, trust, and mutual benefit, but it also creates situations where authority is not absolute. The billionaire's belief that he had sole authority on the yacht was not just an error in perception, it was a misunderstanding of the actual power structure. In partnerships, ownership rights mean that decisions and control are distributed. This means that the woman had just as much right to be on the yacht as he did, regardless of how he perceived her. The fact that this reality had to be revealed to him in such a dramatic way underscores how often people overlook or disregard the less visible holders of power. Influence, which often accompanies ownership, can also exist outside public recognition. People who are underestimated because they do not fit traditional images of power can wield influence in ways that are less direct but equally impactful. The woman's quiet presence was, in itself, a form of influence. Without raising her voice or asserting her rights prematurely, she allowed the billionaire to operate under a false sense of control until the truth surfaced naturally. This kind of influence does not depend on spectacle. It relies on the patience and confidence that come from knowing one's position is secure. The danger of assuming that ownership must be obvious is that it blinds people to the diverse ways power can be distributed. A yacht, a company, or a piece of land can have multiple owners, and each one's claim is valid regardless of how they choose to present themselves. In social interactions, however, this truth is often overshadowed by assumptions about appearance and status. The billionaire's reaction was a direct result of ignoring that possibility. His wealth had taught him that ownership was something you could spot instantly, a certain look, a certain demeanor, and so he missed what was right in front of him. The woman's role in this story is a reminder that power does not have to be loud to be real. Her ownership was not diminished by her quiet demeanor or modest appearance. If anything, those qualities amplified the impact of the revelation. The power dynamic shifted in an instant, not because she gained anything new, but because the billionaire was forced to see what had been there all along. This is the essence of hidden ownership. It does not seek validation, but when challenged, it can redefine the terms of the interaction entirely. Racial and social bias often operate subtly, shaping perceptions and decisions before anyone consciously recognizes their influence. They are embedded in cultural narratives, social conditioning, and historical inequalities, and they can be as present on a luxurious yacht as they are in any other space. In the encounter between the billionaire and the simple black woman, bias played a central role in how events unfolded. The billionaire's judgment of her was not based on her actions, her words, or her behavior in that moment. Instead, it was filtered through unspoken assumptions about race, class, and belonging. He looked at her and, within seconds, concluded she did not fit into the environment. That conclusion was not just about her presence, it was about what her presence represented in his mind. Racial bias, whether overt or unconscious, often manifests in snap judgments. These judgments can lead people to underestimate the competence, status, or worth of others based purely on skin color. For someone like the billionaire, who was accustomed to environments where most of his peers looked like him, the presence of a black woman who appeared simple by his standards likely triggered ingrained stereotypes. These could range from assumptions about economic status to beliefs about social access. Such biases are rarely formed in isolation, they are built over a lifetime through exposure to media portrayals, personal experiences, and societal messaging that reinforce certain hierarchies. Social bias, which often overlaps with racial bias, adds another layer to the interaction. Social status is typically inferred through clothing, speech patterns, grooming, and body language. The billionaire's sense of social order on the yacht was tied to visible symbols of wealth and prestige. The woman's understated presence may have clashed with his expectations of how an owner or even a welcomed guest should look. In high-status spaces, people who do not display the correct social signals are often perceived as outsiders, regardless of their actual standing. This is why bias can be so insidious. It can override factual reality without the person holding the bias even realizing it. The most telling aspect of bias is how it shapes behavior before facts are considered. The billionaire did not pause to ask the woman her name, her reason for being there, or her connection to the yacht. His decision to confront her was made on the strength of his assumptions alone. This is a hallmark of bias in action. It shortcuts the process of inquiry and jumps straight to judgment. The harm is not only in the act itself but in the presumption of authority it reveals. The billionaire assumed his perception was correct, and because he held a position of wealth and influence, he believed he had the right to enforce it without verification. For the woman, this interaction was likely not a new experience. People who are often on the receiving end of racial or social bias develop a heightened awareness of how they are perceived. They learn to recognize the signs, the lingering glance, the cautious body language, the subtle shifts in tone. This awareness can be exhausting, but it also equips them to navigate situations strategically. In this case, her choice to remain composed and let events unfold was a demonstration of control in the face of bias. She understood that the truth of her status would eventually override the billionaire's assumptions, and she did not need to fight to be believed in that instant. The intersection of racial and social bias also reveals how power is enforced in exclusive spaces. Luxury settings like private yachts are often seen as bastions of privilege, accessible only to a narrow group of people. When someone who does not match the visual or cultural profile of that group appears, it can provoke discomfort or even hostility from those who feel ownership over the space. This sense of ownership is not always literal, it can be symbolic, tied to the idea that certain spaces are meant for certain kinds of people. The billionaire's reaction reflected both a personal and cultural belief that the yacht was a space where people like him set the rules. Bias thrives in homogeneous environments where there is little challenge to prevailing assumptions. The fewer examples people see of diversity in positions of power or ownership, the easier it is for stereotypes to persist. In this way, the billionaire's misjudgment was not simply a personal failing but a symptom of a larger social pattern. The fact that he was surprised by the woman's ownership reveals how rarely he had encountered such a scenario, and how deeply his expectations had been shaped by a narrow view of who holds wealth and influence. When bias goes unexamined, it becomes a silent driver of exclusion. People who are misjudged in this way are often forced to prove themselves before being accepted, even when their legitimacy is beyond question. The woman in this situation did not owe the billionaire an explanation, yet the social dynamic made it seem as though she needed one. This imbalance reflects the enduring power of bias, the way it shifts the burden of proof onto those who are perceived as outsiders, regardless of the reality of their position. Humility in power is a quality that is often overlooked, especially in environments where wealth and influence dominate. It requires the ability to recognize that authority does not grant infallibility, that being in a position of control does not mean one is always right, and that other people's perspectives and rights deserve equal respect. In the encounter between the billionaire and the simple black woman on the yacht, the absence of humility was clear in the billionaire's initial actions. His confidence in his own authority was so absolute that he felt no need to question his assumptions or consider alternative explanations. He acted as though his position exempted him from the basic courtesy of inquiry. True humility in power involves pausing before acting, especially when making judgments about others. It means understanding that wealth and status can distort perspective, making it easy to mistake privilege for wisdom. The billionaire's reaction demonstrated the opposite, a reflexive assertion of dominance based on limited information. His inability to see beyond his own assumptions reflected a mindset in which power was exercised as a unilateral right, not as a responsibility. Such a mindset is common among those who have grown accustomed to having their decisions go unchallenged. Over time, this lack of challenge can erode the habit of self-reflection, leading to overconfidence in one's own perceptions. Humility requires an acknowledgement of the limits of personal knowledge. Even the most successful and influential individuals cannot know everything, nor can they accurately assess every situation at first glance. A humble leader or figure of authority would have approached the woman with openness, asking about her connection to the yacht rather than assuming she did not belong. This small act of seeking information before making a judgment is the essence of humility in action. It recognizes the dignity of the other person and avoids the unnecessary harm that comes from acting on false assumptions. One of the most powerful aspects of humility is its ability to foster respect, both given and received. People who lead with humility tend to earn trust more easily because their actions signal that they value fairness and truth over ego. In contrast, arrogance in power often breeds resentment and can damage relationships, even in spaces where the powerful individual holds all the formal authority. On the yacht, the billionaire's initial arrogance not only risked alienating someone with equal ownership but also exposed a weakness in his leadership style, the inability to manage interactions with grace when status was not immediately visible. Humility in power also involves recognizing that others may possess forms of influence or authority that are not immediately apparent. The billionaire assumed he was the sole decision-maker in the situation because he equated visible wealth and control of the yacht with absolute authority. Had he approached the interaction with humility, he might have discovered the truth about her ownership without the embarrassment of being proven wrong. Humility makes room for the unexpected, allowing for the possibility that one's initial understanding may be incomplete or incorrect. There is also a strategic strength in humility. It can prevent conflicts before they escalate, protect reputations, and create an environment where cooperation is more likely than confrontation. By approaching others with respect and a willingness to listen, those in power can avoid making unnecessary enemies or undermining their own credibility. The billionaire, by failing to exercise humility, risked not only offending the woman but also jeopardizing the cooperative spirit necessary in shared ownership. In partnerships of any kind, arrogance can fracture trust, while humility can strengthen it. Humility is not weakness. In fact, it often requires more self-control than assertiveness. It involves resisting the urge to dominate a situation simply because one can. In the context of the yacht encounter, humility would have meant resisting the impulse to immediately enforce perceived authority. It would have meant approaching the interaction as an opportunity to understand rather than to command. This shift in approach could have preserved dignity on both sides, avoiding the imbalance created by an unfounded order to leave. Another key element of humility in power is the recognition that respect is reciprocal. People are far more likely to respect leaders or figures of authority who treat them with fairness and consideration. The billionaire's later realization that the woman was a co-owner would have carried far less personal embarrassment if his initial behavior had been guided by humility. Instead, his lack of it amplified the impact of the revelation, making the reversal of power dynamics more pronounced. Humility could have safeguarded him from that loss of face by ensuring that his first interaction was measured and respectful, regardless of who she was. When humility is absent, power becomes fragile. It relies on the illusion of control and the compliance of others rather than on genuine respect or mutual understanding. The billionaire's authority on the yacht felt absolute to him until a single fact, the woman's ownership, dismantled it. Humility would have prepared him for such possibilities, grounding his sense of control in adaptability rather than in rigid assumptions. In this way, rewriting the narrative begins when an established story or expectation is disrupted by new information, forcing people to reconsider their assumptions and beliefs. In the encounter between the billionaire and the simple black woman on the yacht, the narrative in the billionaire's mind was clear from the start. He was the unquestioned authority in a space he believed belonged exclusively to him, and she was an outsider who had somehow found her way into that space. This story shaped how he saw her, how he interpreted her presence, and how he decided to act. His version of events was so firmly held that he felt confident confronting her without hesitation. Yet narratives, no matter how convincing they seem, can be rewritten in an instant when they collide with reality. The rewriting in this case began the moment the truth of her ownership emerged. It was a single fact, but it carried the power to dismantle the billionaire's original story. Suddenly, the roles he had assigned were reversed. She was no longer an outsider in his mind, she was his equal in ownership, with just as much right to be on the yacht as he had. This shift was not merely about correcting a factual error, it was about transforming the entire framework through which he viewed the situation. Once that transformation began, it became impossible for him to see her in the same way again. Rewriting the narrative is often uncomfortable for those who have benefited from the original one. The billionaire's first version of events reinforced his authority and placed him in control. It confirmed his belief in his ability to judge situations quickly and act decisively. The revised narrative, however, forced him to confront his own fallibility. It required him to acknowledge that his judgment had been wrong, that his assumptions had been biased, and that his understanding of the power dynamics on the yacht had been incomplete. For someone accustomed to being right, this kind of recalibration can be a jarring experience. For the woman, the rewriting of the narrative carried a different weight. She had entered the situation knowing the truth of her position, yet she allowed the billionaire's mistaken version to play out until it corrected itself. This patience can be a powerful act, as it forces the other person to confront their error on their own terms. When the truth surfaced, it did so with undeniable force, leaving no room for the billionaire to cling to his original story. In that moment, the narrative was not just rewritten, it was publicly overturned, even if the audience was small. Rewriting the narrative in situations like this also challenges broader societal scripts. The billionaire's initial assumption was not created in a vacuum. It was supported by cultural images and stereotypes about who owns luxury assets and who does not. By revealing herself as a co-owner, the woman disrupted those stereotypes, offering a counterexample that could ripple beyond the moment. Every time such a narrative is rewritten, it chips away at the collective beliefs that sustain bias. The more these counterexamples occur and are acknowledged, the harder it becomes for the old stories to maintain their hold. The process of rewriting also reveals how fragile certain narratives are. They may feel solid when unchallenged, but they can crumble quickly when confronted with a single, undeniable truth. In this way, rewriting the narrative is both a personal and societal act. On a personal level, it forces the individual to adapt their understanding and accept a more accurate version of events. On a societal level, it contributes to shifting norms and expectations, making space for more inclusive and truthful stories to take root. The billionaire's reaction after the truth emerged would have been shaped by the sudden need to reconcile his previous certainty with the new reality. Such a reconciliation often involves a mix of embarrassment, defensiveness, and eventual acceptance. This is the emotional cost of rewriting the narrative, the realization that the original story was not only wrong but potentially harmful. It places the storyteller in a position where they must account for the gap between perception and reality. For someone in a position of power, this moment can serve as a lesson in humility and awareness, though only if they are willing to internalize the experience rather than dismiss it as an anomaly. Rewriting the narrative does not erase the initial harm caused by the original version, but it does offer an opportunity for change. Once a narrative has been proven false, the person who held it must decide how to move forward, whether to cling to the remnants of the old story or to embrace the new one and allow it to reshape their behavior. In the best cases, this shift can lead to greater fairness, openness, and understanding in future interactions. In the worst cases, it may only prompt surface-level adjustments without deeper reflection. The direction it takes depends entirely on the willingness of the individual to let the rewritten version replace the old one completely. In this particular encounter, the rewritten narrative carried a clear reversal of perceived power. The billionaire, once in the position of unquestioned control, was forced to recognize that his authority was shared. The woman, once seen as an intruder, was affirmed as an equal. This reversal was not symbolic, it was backed by tangible fact. Such moments demonstrate how quickly and decisively a narrative can change when truth enters the picture, and how those changes can leave a lasting impression on everyone involved. Humility serves as both a moral and practical safeguard for those in positions of influence.